I'm Jim Donovan.
And I'm Sarah Shookman. And as you can see, we have a very special friend of the show with us tonight to help moderate with our panel of doctors, our senior health correspondent, Monica Robbins.
And we are very happy to have 4 local doctors with us to answer your questions about COVID-19 and children and the vaccine. So let me introduce them. From Akron Children's Hospital, we have Dr. Michael Bigham, Chief Quality Officer and Pediatric Critical Care Physician. We also have Dr. Michael Forbes, Chair of the Department of Pediatrics and Critical Care Physician. Dr. Kimberly Giuliano joins us from Cleveland Clinic Children. She serves as Chair of Primary Care Pediatrics. And Dr. Amy Edwards, Assistant Professor of Pediatrics, Division of Pediatric Infectious Diseases with Rainbow Babies and Children's Hospital.
So let's get right to it. Experts say vaccinating children is a very important step in helping them get back to normal.
But many still acknowledge the decision for parents may be difficult given the newness of the vaccine.
As well as the illness's less severe impacts on children compared to older people. So how did we get here? 18 months after the coronavirus took hold in the United States, its grip has shifted. Whereas once children rarely showed up in hospitals, that has changed.
We know that when the virus first came into the United States, children accounted for less than 3% of cases. Now they account for 27% of cases. We'll have 200,000 cases of disease in children a week, or 250,000 cases a week.
That takes us to today, with 28 million children ages 5 to 11 eligible, is a potential game changer in the fight against the pandemic.
I think it's great. I think all kids need vaccinations because it's still spreading through kids.
I have a almost 2-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 7-year-old, and I will not be getting them vaccinated right now.
While parents are divided and in some cases undecided, here's what's clear. In that 5 to 11 age range, 8,300 children have been hospitalized with COVID, and 146 have died, making it the 8th highest killer.
Does COVID cause problems for most children? The answer is no. But tell that to the parents of the children who are fighting for their lives as we speak.
Children hospitalized with COVID tend to have underlying conditions such as obesity or diabetes. Then there's the MIS-C, or multi-system inflammatory syndrome. Rare in children, but life-threatening. It can cause hyperactive immune response that attacks the body. 5,200 children in the U.S. diagnosed with COVID have developed that complication. It's most common among kids 6 to 11. Who had no pre-existing conditions and were considered healthy.
I'd never heard of it, or I'd have had her in there sooner. So that night she ended up in the ICU, and the next day she was put on a ventilator.
It's a reality no parent wants to face as they bear the weight of a decision while balancing medical advice with head, heart, and instinct for the ones they love. So I'm here in the Health Hub with 2 of our doctors, and I want to remind you that our discussion will continue at 7:30 on our digital platforms, which you can find on WKYC.com, the WKYC Facebook page. We're streaming this, as well as the WKYC YouTube channel. And of course, we want your questions, so feel free to put them in the comments section. But I want to get everything started, and that belongs to Jim Donovan. Jim, back to you.
All right, thanks, Monica. And I'm here with Dr. Michael Forbes from Akron Children's. All right, we're going to go to work. Here we go. Our first question of the night comes from Terry in Broadview Heights. And Terry wants to know, why are dosages, doctor, determined by age and not weight?
That's a great question, as the doses are all a little bit different depending on how old and the ages. But it turns out with vaccines, unlike other medications that we use to treat children, vaccines are based on, we say, developmental biology. Yeah. Your immune system is different as an infant versus a teenager and as an adult. And so what the researchers did in their studies were they found the appropriate dose based on the developmental age of the child.
All right.
And so it's not based on weight.
Good answer, good information. We go to Sarah. She's in the newsroom.
Yeah, thanks, Jimmy and Dr. Forbes. Now, I'm here with Dr. Kimberly Giuliano with Cleveland Clinic. And one of our viewers, Dr. Giuliano, she wrote in, my child will be turning 12 at the end of November. Should I get her the pediatric dose now or wait until she's 12 so she can get the adult-sized dose?
So I'd recommend getting the vaccine as soon as you possibly have access to it. The longer we go unprotected, the greater our chances of getting an infection would be. And we are really reassured that the effectiveness of the lower dose for the 11-year-olds is really, really high. So getting that lower dose today is probably going to provide just as much immunity as a higher dose would in just a few more weeks. So if we have access to it, I'd say go for it now.
Yeah, as soon as you can.
Yeah.
All right, Dr. Giuliano, thank you so much. Let's get back to the Health Hub where we find Monica Robbins.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Dr. Edwards, I want to start with you. How can I trust this when the child research was just a couple of months long?
You know, that's a really great question, and it's one I actually get a lot. But what I want to emphasize is pediatric vaccine trials are actually always fairly short. We don't think about that because we actually see that the whole trial might last several years. But the actual reason for that has more to do with logistics and enrollment and things like that. But what you actually only need for pediatric vaccine trials is a couple months of safety data, usually 3 or 4 months is the standard, and then efficacy, which we already have both of those. And so there's nothing about this vaccine trial that's different from other pediatric vaccine trials.
So this was just mainly looking at safety, right?
Safety and antibody response and vaccine efficacy. They actually did all three.
Okay, Dr. Bigham, let me move on to you. This question is about a rare heart condition in kids that can be triggered by the COVID-19 vaccine. So this questioner says, I'm afraid of giving my child the vaccine because of myocarditis. Isn't there a high risk?
Sure. I think it's important first to understand what is myocarditis. It's an inflammation of the heart muscle. That inflammation can sometimes cause heart rhythm abnormalities. It can also cause heart dysfunction. But in order to answer that question fully, we need to think about two things. We need to think about what is the risk of myocarditis with the vaccine. So in the youngest kids, those kids 5 to 11, they found no cases of myocarditis. In fact, they were careful after they enrolled the first 1,500 patients in the trial. They actually doubled the number of enrollees in the trial to make sure that they didn't see any of these uncommon vaccine complications like myocarditis. Now, in time, there might be a low rate of those, but I think the counter to that is, well, what if I don't get a vaccine but instead get COVID-19 infection? And what is the risk of myocarditis with that? And what we know fairly certainly by the literature is that the risk of myocarditis is greater with the COVID-19 infection than it is with the vaccine itself.
That's really important information. All right, Jimmy, I will throw it back to you.
Thank you very much, Monica. And I am here with Dr. Forbes. Doctor, a viewer writes in and is worried about the length of time in which data has been collected. So they write in and say, I don't want my child to be a science experiment for a vaccine that doesn't have any long-term data. How can you say this is safe?
Oh, that's a great question. It turns out the vaccine does what it does, and whatever effects happen from the vaccine happen fairly quickly within the first few weeks to maybe months. And after that, it's gone. In fact, if you notice, we're all getting boosters these days. That's because the effect of the vaccine wanes after it appears about 6 to 9 months. And so as far as long-term effects, we don't really think in terms of long-term effects because the vaccine doesn't really stick around that long.
And we roll along with more questions. Sarah and Dr. Giuliano are in the newsroom. Sarah, one more question before we take our first break.
We are getting some really great, important questions from you. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. So a quick question for you, Dr. Giuliano, about dosage size. We had a viewer ask, can the first dose be pediatric and the second dose adult?
Yes. So the recommendations are that you get the dose for the age that you are on the day of vaccination. So if you're 11 on day 1 for dose 1, you'll get that lower dose. And if you turn 12 between the two, then you will get the second dose to be a little bit higher.
So parents for tweens can have some confidence in, again, as soon as you have access to this vaccine, getting it.
Absolutely.
Even 21-day birthdays in between.
Right, right. And regardless of whether you're getting that 10 or 30 microgram dose, we know that it's effective. And we know that there's just slightly less risk of side effects at the lower dose. So I would definitely go ahead and get that first dose as soon as possible.
Absolutely. All right, Dr. Giuliano, thank you so much. Still ahead, a family shares their own experience after their 5-month-old baby girl suffered complications from COVID-19. Their message tonight to other parents.
So stay with us. We're answering more of your kids and COVID questions in minutes. Welcome back. While kids are typically thought of as a lower risk for serious cases of the coronavirus, those chances have risen significantly now with the Delta variant.
And one Summit County family told us how the virus struck them and the complications that followed for their little girl.
The Peacock family's battle with the coronavirus started like many stories you've heard, even for 5-month-old Madeline.
Some congestion, fatigue, just kind of irritable. I mean, she was 5 months old, so I couldn't really ask her exactly how she was feeling.
What they thought was initially a cold was actually COVID-19. Lauren, her husband, and their 2 daughters all tested positive.
About 2 weeks later, once we were out of our quarantine period, it seemed like everybody was doing pretty well.
The kids went back to daycare and they went back to work. Then Lauren, a nurse at Cleveland Clinic, got this message on her way home from a night shift.
I get this picture of her feet and her hands, and they're purple. And they're like, hey, Maddie's really not feeling too well. I think you should come and pick her up.
The Peacocks rushed their baby to the emergency room, where little Maddie tested positive for COVID again and took a turn for the worse.
And I can see out of the corner of my eye, her heart rate is like going up into the 240s, 250s, 260s. And I can see that she's having a hard time breathing. She's grunting. Her eyes are closed. I just turned to them and I said, this is not her baseline. You guys need to get people in here because this isn't normal. My husband and I were just like sitting there sobbing because at that point, she just really didn't look good. I really felt like we were gonna lose her.
Doctors got Maddie stabilized in the ICU and diagnosed her with Miss C, cases of multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children, a condition where some organs become inflamed, have spiked for kids who've had COVID-19.
Even the doctors don't really know yet what puts a child more at risk for this.
Maddie spent 10 days in the hospital recovering with the help of an antibody treatment typically reserved for cancer patients.
I think it'll be a while before, parents like myself, have answers to some of our questions.
Maddie is now 15 months old and thriving, but Lauren still worries about the future.
Please, please put your kid in a mask. Keep social distancing. Vaccinate them if you can. It was really, truly a parent's worst nightmare.
Yeah, Jimmy, I mean, this is worst case scenario here.
Yeah.
And I think the scary thing is the risk, as Laura said, doctors really don't know yet. It is also new what makes otherwise healthy kids at risk for Miss C and some other complications after even what seems like mild coronavirus illness.
You know what the basic frightening part of that story is? That's a little baby and they can't tell you.
Right.
Right? How they're
Yes.
feeling or what the complications are. And what a heads up set of parents to really realize that there was something really seriously wrong.
Absolutely, and they still can't be vaccinated.
Right.
Kids under 5 years old. So there's another push here again to protect the community by vaccinating the rest of us.
Well, thank heavens.
Yes.
Maddie looks great.
I know.
Absolutely.
Thank
Over to the
goodness.
Health Hub right now. And here's Monica.
Hey, thanks so much, Jimmy. Yeah, we were listening to that story, and Dr. Bigham, I want to start with you about that. Brought up a great point about the kids who are admitted with Miss C. They're obviously not vaccinated. Are their families vaccinated?
Not typically. Most of our experience, whether they've been admitted to the hospital with COVID-19 infection or admitted to the hospital with Miss C, their families are generally not vaccinated. And that's probably where they were initially exposed to the COVID-19 infection.
We have another question from Adriana from Amherst. She wants to know, what are the side effects with the vaccine in children? Because I think a lot of parents are really concerned about that.
Sure. I'm a parent. I can probably agree with Adriana that we spend most of our days thinking about how to protect our children and keeping them well, and why would we knowingly expose them to something that would make them ill or maybe have a side effect of the vaccine. And I think there's two things to know. Number one, it's when children are having side effects of the COVID-19 vaccine, that generally means their body's mounting the immune response. That's what we want the vaccine to do. The side effects that we're commonly seeing are arm pain. That happens with lots of vaccines, including the COVID-19 vaccine. Very short-lived. It rarely lasts more than a couple days, often less than a day. We are seeing some children with headaches or fevers, sometimes some muscle aches. What we do know is when they did this study, they kept reducing the dose for these younger children, and they wanted to get to the dose that had that that robust immune response that we want the vaccine to have, but had the least amount of side effects. And that's how they landed on this dose for the 5 to 11-year-olds that's lower than the adult dose.
The other thing that's an issue, though, is a lot of parents are like, hey, wait a minute, what about the dosing for a 5-year-old compared to the size of an 11-year-old? How can it be the same, and how can it work for both age groups?
Yeah, well, I think what we need to understand is how the immune system works. It's a fantastic machine, and what we know is that the immune system matures at a particular rate based on an age, and that may not necessarily coincide with how tall a patient is or how much a patient weighs, and it's really the immune system maturity that's really setting the standard about what vaccine dose is used.
That makes a lot of sense. And I know a lot of people had said to me, Dr. Edwards, that my child had COVID, did absolutely fine, so my kid built the antibody response and now is protected. Why should I get my child a vaccine? Is that true?
Well, it's certainly true that a natural infection gives you protection for a time, typically for a couple of months. It's not true that that protection is very lasting. And so what we are urging parents to do is to still get their children vaccinated, because even with prior infection, kids are at risk for MIS-C, kids are at risk for long-haul COVID, and the vaccine protects from that. And so once your kid is recovered and back to their normal self, we still say that kids should get vaccinated if they've had COVID.
All right, we're going to throw to break. I know we have a lot more questions we want to get in, so for now, we'll be back in a moment.
Welcome back, everybody, to our special Facts Not Fear, Your Kids in COVID Town Hall. Dr. Michael Forbes has been my partner here at the desk. We get to another question from one of our viewers. Nancy from Wadsworth writes in, is it safe to send an unvaccinated child to daycare?
Well, we're in the vaccine era now that we know that COVID is a vaccine-preventable illness. We knew in the pre-vaccine era how to prevent infections in kids when they go to daycare. So now we know we need to wash our hands, keep our distance, avoid large crowds, and in the vaccine era, anyone who's eligible to be vaccinated needs to be vaccinated. And if those criteria are met, then I think it's okay to have your child go to daycare.
Isn't it amazing? The first commandment is wash your hands.
Just wash your hands. It has not changed.
All right, back over to the newsroom right now. Here's Sarah.
Oh, our favorite thing to hear from Monica. Every flu season and extra special during this pandemic for sure. All right, let's fit in one more question with Dr. Giuliano here from Cleveland Clinic. So Tina from Mayfield Heights is asking us, is there any guidance or concern for receiving this vaccine with the timing and spacing of other regularly scheduled vaccines for this age group?
So it's absolutely fine to get other vaccines the same day you get your COVID vaccine or in close proximity, even on different days. When the vaccine first came out earlier this past year, out of an abundance of caution, the CDC said, let's wait a few weeks just to make sure that it's okay.
Sure.
And now we know that it is okay. We know that these vaccines are safe, and we know that they're effective, and our other vaccines are effective too. So certainly any opportunity you have to vaccinate against COVID or any other vaccine, we certainly recommend doing that now and not waiting.
Staying on that regular schedule at your appointments.
Absolutely.
All right, Dr. Giuliano, thank you so much. Well, our Front Row Town Hall will return right after this break.
Well, we want to thank you for watching this special COVID-19 Town Hall. And while we covered a lot of information, your questions are pouring in.
Yeah, and our panel of doctors is going to stick around to answer more of those questions.
Yeah, Monica and I will be heading back into the Health Hub for the live digital portion of this show, Facts Not Fear, Your Kids and COVID Town Hall. So stay with us on WKYC.com, our app, or our Facebook page to get your questions answered. Have a great night.
Hey, everybody. everybody. Welcome to the digital portion of our vaccine, Facts Not Fear, talking about kids, the vaccine, and COVID. Of course, the FDA, CDC signed off on vaccines for kids 5 to 11 just recently. Dr. Forbes, I want to start with you because I've been having a lot of people, while we know kids 5 to 11 can now get access to the vaccine, what about the younger ones? Do you have any insight as to when they may be able to get vaccinated?
That's a great question. I would ask Dr. Edwards.
All right, I'll pass this along to Dr. Edwards.
Yeah, so they're done with enrollment for kids 5 and under. They are doing a similar thing how they did with the 5 to 11. They're doing a dose trial, and then they're going to look at antibody response and possibly vaccine efficacy. So fingers crossed, we're hoping late winter, sometime, February, March of 2022.
So are we looking at like 2 to 5 or 6 months to 5?
6 months to 5.
Wow, really? And because Moderna is, their age separation is a little different, right?
Yes, I don't think they're going down to 6 months with Moderna. I think it's a year or 2 years. I don't remember.
All right, I want to remind everybody, Sarah is over here, and she is monitoring our web, essentially, and you can ask questions via Twitter at hashtag 3vaccine. You can also ask questions on our Facebook and our YouTube, and you can text them to 216-344-3300. You got anything interesting over there?
I do. This is a great question I think maybe any of you would be able to answer. So Rachel in Maslin asks, how are doctors, pharmacists, and other experts staying educated and updated on these COVID vaccines? Who wants to jump in?
We're talking to each other. There's a lot of data out there. So even within my department, we talk to each other. If I have time to go to a conference but somebody else doesn't, then we meet every Thursday in our department and we educate each other on the various things that we learned during that week. And then we meet with our colleagues from other departments and we talk. They tell me things that they've learned and I tell them things that I've learned. It is a rapidly evolving situation, but there are a lot of us and we work together very well.
I know you have small children and you have a 5-year-old.
Yes.
And a lot of parents have asked me, how do I talk to my 5-year-old about this and how do I prepare my child for this? What are you doing with your own child? And more importantly, are you going to get your child vaccinated?
My child is getting vaccinated on next Saturday. I'm very excited. And basically, she knows about COVID. I mean, she's watched me go through this, or I'd rather say she's watched me be absent at home while I've dealt with this in the hospital. And she's very excited to get the vaccine. She's not loving the idea of the needle, but the pack of M&Ms she's getting afterwards, she's super excited about. And, you handle it like all the other things. My kids get the flu shot. They have to get shots for school and for health. And kids sometimes have to do things they don't love to do, but we're parents and we have to do what's best for our kids.
That's a great. Dr. Giuliano, I want to ask you something because I think I know none of you are psychiatrists, but one of the things I'm hearing a lot from parents is that they're very scared and they are a little guilty if they've been vaccinated and they're not sure they want to get their child vaccinated. Have you been having these conversations with parents?
Yes, there's a lot of parents out there that have been vaccinated and they're just wondering if that's the right thing to do for their child. So you're certainly not alone if you're having those thoughts. I've been really reassured by the data that's come out over the last couple of weeks showing just how safe this vaccine is, how we're able to get a good immune response with a much lower dose. And so I'm really confident that our children are going to tolerate this well. They tend to get more sore arms, but less of the fevers, less of the muscle aches, less of the fatigue. So certainly I understand where parents' concerns can come from, but really, even if you've had a rough reaction to a vaccine, doesn't mean that's going to happen for your child.
That's great advice. Sarah, I'll throw it over to you.
Yeah, so here's another question that, in terms of misinformation and things that people are seeing out there. Tammy from Facebook asks, since there hasn't been much testing on children, which I know we've clearly talked about the extent of the testing, but adults have had 2 shots. Now we keep hearing about boosters all the time. Are we following a money trail here? I don't know what to believe.
Anybody?
Yeah,
Dr. Bigham?
I can maybe just start. First of all, I think it's important to know that we're professionals. Physicians, scientists are professionals. There's there's actually nothing lucrative about this other than the sort of the reassurance that we get in child health. That's the real investment that we're making, is in child health. And so when we talk about, I hear this a lot about, well, doctors are being funded or they're getting kickbacks from big pharma. That's just not the case. What we care about is the health and wellness of kids. And the health and wellness of kids, any strategies that we have that can help us keep kids healthy. We get paid when kids are in the hospital, but we get charged, we get emotionally committed when we can keep kids out of the hospital. And this is one of those strategies that we know we haven't had it at our hospital. For example, at Akron Children's, we have not had a single patient admitted to the hospital with a COVID-19 infection who has been vaccinated. So practically speaking, the more of those kids that we can get vaccinated, the fewer of those kids that will end up in the hospital with COVID-19 or MIS-C.
And how concerned are you now that we're going into cold and flu season and we still have a lot of kids who may not be vaccinated? Dr. Forbes, I'm going to throw this one at you.
Sure.
Yeah, I think at this point, it's a vaccine-preventable illness. And so the more of the community that gets vaccinated, the higher our level of community health. And so just like we would with any winter season, there is some concern about rhinovirus, RSV, and of course COVID, but we know how to prevent this. And so whether it's COVID or rhinovirus or RSV, we know the basics in the toolkit, right? Wash your hands, keep your distance, wear your mask. And when it comes to coronavirus, getting vaccinated makes sure that you create this bubble of protection in the community. And so, yeah, they're going to be there, but we can be ready now. And so I think that's the message, is we can protect ourselves now.
Sarah?
Yeah, we've gotten some really specific questions. Thank you. Just talking to our producers here. Here's one. Obviously, people can go to their own pediatrician and ask specific questions as well, and we encourage that. Anne from Middleburg Heights is asking, if a child has von Willebrand disease, a blood clotting disorder, should they receive the COVID vaccination?
There really is not a medical condition that is a contraindication for the COVID vaccine in children. The only thing that I would tell parents is if you want to ask about your specific medical problem, then you want to talk to the specialist or the pediatrician who's managing that specific illness. And the only case that I would have any hesitancy about is a kid who has multiple severe allergies to drugs and other vaccines. Outside of that, I would be more concerned about how bad the child would do with COVID than with the vaccine.
Agreed.
Sarah?
Yeah, one other question. I know Dr. Giuliano and I were talking about this a little bit with the schedule of vaccines earlier in the show. Here's a specific question. Casey on Facebook is asking, what about the flu shot and the COVID shot? Can they get those? We know that's always popular in the fall. Can you get them at the same time?
You absolutely can get your COVID vaccine and your flu vaccine at the same time. And it's really recommended that you do if you have that opportunity. Delaying either one of them, right now you're playing a little bit of a gambling risk, right? Because flu's not here yet, but it likely will be here relatively soon. COVID certainly is here. And so if you're choosing one over the other, we don't know what you're going to be exposed to in the interim, right? So, and it's definitely safe to go ahead and get them at the same time or in close proximity to each other.
I've had a number of parents say now that they're available, they're kind of hedging toward, I want to wait a couple of weeks until everybody else gets their kids vaccinated to see what happens. We've got the holidays coming. What is your advice to those parents who just kind of want to do the wait and see thing?
I guess my advice would be, using the holiday example, is that's all the more reason to get it sooner rather than later. We know that people travel around the holidays. We know there's often family gatherings, and that would be the best time to have your child fully protected. I think waiting and seeing really just puts you at risk for that interim period until you've been fully vaccinated. And I think conversely, getting a vaccine soon gets you to that point of immunity more quickly.
Sarah?
Yeah, absolutely. So one question for Dr. Forbes here. Misinformation is another topic we want to discuss. Parents have been bombarded with information, and sometimes when you go looking, you get more even than you had hoped. What can people do to find accurate information?
Yeah, wow, that's a great question. I think one of the things that we've struggled with maybe from the very beginning of the pandemic is around misinformation. And so I tend to focus on reliable sources that I've been dependent on really throughout my education. And so the CDC, the World Health Organization, those types of agencies that study disease on a regular basis is where I begin to get the facts. And we had a question earlier about misinformation and where you get your information. I actually seek out sometimes some of the misinformation to get a sense of what's out there so that we can combat that. And when you've been misinformed, it's not a good thing. But again, the facts are there for the CDC, from the CDC, the World Health Organization. Again, two really terrific sites to get the facts, and then you can go from there.
Monica, if I can just add to that, I think you used a key word there. As you said, you go, Dr. Forbes, to sources that you trust, that you have experience with. And sometimes those are written sources like the CDC, but other times it's pediatricians, right? I think I'm a parent. I know that I'm a pediatrician also, but I know that I trust my child's pediatrician. And I think when families are uncertain around their child's health decisions, I would really encourage them to have a frank conversation with their pediatrician or their healthcare provider, because we have a patient-doctor trusting relationship, and you can get those questions answered, and presuming that you trust your pediatrician, you can get another source that you feel confident in.
We're getting a lot of questions about weight. And this one question came in that she has a 10-year-old who is 5'3" and 125 pounds. And she doesn't understand why this child should only get a pediatric dose. And one of the questions is, so why is that? And also, is it possible for them to get the pediatric dose first and then maybe an adult dose second?
I think any of us could take it. So I'll take it. So it's to do, people think that medication should be weight-based dosed. And it should be. That's normal. But when you think about vaccines, it's a little different. So with medicine, like antibiotics, I'm an infectious disease doctor. I prescribe antibiotics. You want the antibiotic to get all over the body so that it can find the source of infection and kill it off. That's why we have to do weight-based dosing, because it depends on how much weight I'm distributing that antibiotic over. But a vaccine's different. It's not a medicine. What I need to do is stimulate the immune system. That's not weight-based. That's immune-based. And so it has more to do with where the child's immune system is in development than it has to do with what their weight is. And I think one way to really think about this is think about your flu shot. We don't have separate flu shots for very obese adults, do we? But we do have a different dose for older people whose immune system isn't working very well. And we have different doses for very, very young kids, because it has more to do with where your immune system is in its development than it does with your body weight. And so it does not matter height, it does not matter weight, it matters age.
That is the best explanation I've heard in a long time. Sarah?
Absolutely, and I'm so glad we touched on that, because it is a theme. Jennifer on Facebook was just asking very similar questions all around that weight issue. Another theme I keep picking up from a lot of our folks who are with us online right now, this idea of natural immunity. What does it mean to have natural immunity? Donna is asking, Teresa and Amherst asking, a 6-year-old public school child who had COVID this year, should they still get vaccinated? And maybe if you could kind of answer both of those questions at once for us. What natural immunity is, what it looks like, and maybe how long lasting it is, and who needs to be vaccinated as a result of it.
All right, so natural immunity is, well, it's the same as being vaccinated. I don't know how else to explain it. When you get exposed to a virus, your body processes that virus, breaks it down into these little proteins called antigens, and then the immune system reads those antigens and builds antibodies against it, and then you stimulate this whole crosstalk between different types of cells, and you build proteins and you kill a virus. That's from a virus that you get infected with. What a vaccine does is it does the exact same thing. It introduces something called antigens into the body, in this case via an mRNA mechanism, but it's still the same thing, and the body processes those antigens, and then it crosstalks between like T cells and B cells and gives you antibodies. So there's actually not really a big difference in what the immunity looks like inside the body as far as your B cell response, your T cell response, your cytokine response. What does appear to be different is the longevity of the durability of the immunity. So with natural infection, it doesn't appear that immunity is very durable, but with the vaccine, it appears to be a more durable immunity. And so that's the main difference between catching COVID and getting the vaccine, is how long your protection lasts.
And isn't the vaccine giving people 10 times the amount of protection that a natural infection would give them?
So it depends on how you're interpreting that. So it is true that you have higher antibody levels with the vaccine than you do with natural infection, but it has more to do with how clinically relevant it is. So what we know in kids who have been infected, we know that about 80% of them do mount an immune response that prevents them from getting reinfected, at least in the near term, in the next couple of months. But with a vaccine, it's 95%. So what you're seeing is more people get protection, and that protection lasts longer with the vaccine.
Yeah, Mike, if I can add, I think one of the things that's different about natural versus vaccine immunity are also the consequences of those processes, if you may. So as Dr. Bigham pointed out earlier, our patients that are admitted to the hospital tend to be those that have natural infection, and now they have natural immunity, but they also have MIS-C, long COVID, myocarditis, frankly, and other consequences of natural infection, including hospitalization and death. And so the difference between vaccine immunity and natural immunity is the virtual elimination of hospitalization and death, the elimination of MIS-C with vaccine immunity. And so the choice that we all have to make is, do you want natural immunity or vaccine immunity? The other advantage of vaccine immunity that we're appreciating is the likelihood of spreading is lower when you compare vaccinated folks to unvaccinated folks. So controlling the spread of the infection and improving community health is much more easier, frankly, and safer with vaccine immunity than natural immunity.
Yeah, really great points there. So one of the questions we're getting, is from people who are looking for appointments. So we do want to remind everyone, we're taking your questions if you text them to us at 216-344-3300. Also, if you text the word kids to that number, again, that's 216-344-3300. We will send you back an updated list of hospitals, stores where you can schedule this COVID-19 vaccine appointment for your child. And one good question I thought we got was, when is the best time to get them vaccinated? I think we've heard the theme earlier tonight is as soon as possible, but people are asking, what about a Friday? Or, I think the thought is, maybe are we worried about side effects, worried about maybe a little sleepy kid that might take a few extra hours on Saturday morning to recover?
Yeah. So you certainly could think about doing it on a Friday or Saturday to minimize those chances. What is really great about this, though, is that we know the most common side effect for kids is arm soreness and swelling. And the issues like fever, fatigue, muscle aches, those are much less common in the 5 to 11-year-old age group than they were in the 12 and above. So the chances of a younger child having some of those side effects that might keep them out of school is a little bit lower. So I think that's why we can easily say, if you have access to the vaccine on a Tuesday, go for it. If you want to wait till a Friday or Saturday, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, but I wouldn't wait 3 weeks to get that Friday or Saturday appointment.
How many of you have seen 5 to 11-year-olds who've had COVID and have developed long haul syndrome? Of course, Dr. Edwards, because you have a clinic now for kids. What are you seeing with kids specifically with long haul, like the types of symptoms?
Right. So as I've said before, the majority of kids who get long haul COVID are teenagers, but we do have a sprinkling of kids who are under 11 who get long haul COVID, and they're dealing with the same things that the teenagers are dealing with. So we're talking about fatigue, we're talking about severe shortness of breath, inability to play soccer or sports or whatever, headaches, new onset migraines, severe gastrointestinal upset. I have kids that are 11, 10, 9 who can't eat. They've lost their appetite. They're losing weight. They're struggling with loss of smell and taste, and it's unpleasant. Extremely hard to watch.
Are you all concerned about the long haul symptoms, that how long they could potentially last, and if any of these are permanent, because we just don't know?
I'm extremely concerned. So the only thing I have to compare it to is chronic fatigue syndrome, which is a syndrome we don't know a lot about, But if you look at the literature on chronic fatigue syndrome in children, on average, these kids were sick for 2 to 3 years before they had, and not all of them have full recovery. And some kids end up bedridden with feeding tubes, and yeah, long haul COVID terrifies me, quite frankly.
And a vaccine could prevent that?
Absolutely. Yeah, again, the impact of vaccine immunity is a lot of these downstream effects of natural infection are virtually eliminated. And I think that's the strongest argument in my mind to getting the vaccine and getting it early. I mean, you can have natural immunity, and lots of folks who have natural immunity have no symptoms. But again, it's a gamble. And I think if we want to reduce these long-term consequences and stop the spread, the vaccine is the way to go.
You know, one question we've been getting, again, we talked a little bit about parents having to make tough choices for their kids, you know, when they're the right ones. But this viewer says, my child is terrified of needles and can't even watch on TV when they're seeing these shots given. Getting regular shots is a nightmare. How do I do this? How do I talk to my kid about the importance of it? And again, I think in this age group, you know, we're talking 5 to 11-year-olds. They've been living with some of the realities of COVID in school and unfortunately in remote school for some of this time. How do you talk to them about the importance of this?
I think it's important that we talk to them about how we can get back to what is a more normal life for them, right? You'd be surprised how much insight, we think 5 is pretty young, right? But how much insight and remembering of the past that they had, and they want to get back there too. We all want to get back there. Yes. They want to get back there too. And so I think that regardless of how old your child is, whether they're 5 or 15 or 25, having open and honest discussions about why we think this is the best thing for them, asking them what they think, and if they're having questions, being there as that reliable resource for them too. And so if a child feels that they've been heard and feels that they've been trusted, it's a little bit easier for them to accept it. It doesn't mean that a shot necessarily feels good or that they're necessarily going to be excited about it. But if they understand the why behind it, they're much less likely to be scared around it and feel supported, you know, even if it is something that they would rather not be doing.
And maybe if I can just add to that, that child may not be in the position to make the choice, do I or don't I get the COVID vaccine? But I think most of us as pediatricians like to find choices that we do let the child make. So do you want the vaccine in your left arm or your right arm? Would you like to be laying down, or do you want to be sitting on your caregiver or parent's lap? Would you like to bring a special, safety net, a teddy bear or a blanket with you? So I do think allowing a child in this circumstance to have a conversation about and make some decisions that maybe aren't the official decision about whether or not they get the vaccine, but let them being involved in other portions of that decision are useful.
Dr. Giuliano, you talked earlier about the flu shot and the COVID vaccine, that we know you can get those at the same time, but we had a question about other types of childhood vaccines, the MMR, the Tdap shot. Does that have any impact with the COVID vaccine, or can you get all of those at the same time?
You can get any vaccine at the same time as your COVID vaccine. And it's super important that we don't delay those other vaccinations also. Certainly COVID is more prevalent in our community right now, but unfortunately diseases like measles are out there, whooping cough is out there. And so it really is best that we try to get them in as close proximity as we possibly can and stay on schedule.
One question we have, I know so many adults have had this question too, around the technology with mRNA vaccines. Some adults have had options where they were able to maybe choose the J&J, a little more traditional vaccine process that we've known about. The research that shows that the COVID vaccine here, Lisa in Broadview Heights is asking, will not have long-term side effects on children 5 to 11. How can we say or maybe guarantee any minimal risk to them long term? Is there anything special folks should be doing? Okay, Dr. Edwards is reacting right away off camera here.
Mostly because it's one of my favorite questions, because I think it's such a normal question to ask, but yet it makes no biological sense. I mean, there's literally no way for a vaccine to have long-term side effects, and parents are actually misinformed when they say, oh, but we have long-term safety data on these other vaccines. We don't. We don't study long-term safety of vaccines because there's no such thing as long-term safety for vaccines. The vaccine is only in your arm for for like a couple of hours to maybe a day, and then it's gone. You would not take a dose of Tylenol today and then worry about getting cancer 10 years from now. That's illogical. And it's just like that. I mean, I understand where the question's coming from, but from a basic biochemical standpoint, it's not a logical question because there's no biological basis for a vaccine to have a hidden long-term side effect. Any side effect that the vaccine is going to have is going to be in the first 4 to 6 weeks after the shot. Period. End of sentence.
Wow.
Well, one of the other realities along the same lines is that 6 to 9 months after everyone had their first wave of vaccines, there was a need for boosters. Because to your point, it's gone, right? And even the effect starts to wane. So again, there's no, as far as long-term effects, it doesn't exist.
Are kids going to need boosters too?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so there's two considerations. Number one, it's likely that they will, but number two, none of us are booking those third doses yet. I think this is maybe further evidence that we're going to follow the science. The science will tell us whether or not an additional dose is needed. The science may tell us an additional dose, but yet a smaller dose is needed. I think it's too early to know, but I think what I remain confident is that we'll be informed by the science when we make that decision. We aren't making any foregone conclusions now.
And I'll add, we are continuing to follow those children who were enrolled in the study, right? So they'll follow their course of whether or not they get infected, what their antibody levels do. And similar to what we've done with adults, that will help us to inform when the right time is for children. And I think all of us kind of think of it's probably more of a when instead of an if, but certainly the science will let us know that.
One thing, as we're talking about the science here that's coming in right now, maybe you can update us. If a child does get COVID, how are you treating them at this point? Are there specific medications that can be given to help mitigate symptoms? Dr. Bigham?
Well, yeah, thanks for letting me take this one. In the intensive care unit, we do all the things that we do to support the sickest of sick patients, right? Sometimes it's breathing tubes and breathing machines. Sometimes it's blood pressure supporting medicine, and ultimately we're able to get those children through. Those kids that have MIS-C, for example, we're using steroids, we're using a whole slew of different biological medications, immunoglobulins, and so there's a cocktail of things. So for those people that are worried about this cocktail that is a vaccine, what I can be certain of is that the cocktail of managing someone sick in the ICU with COVID is far more complicated than a vaccine. And so again, that would be, I guess, maybe reason to go with a vaccine instead of the risk of the more complicated management medications in the ICU. In terms of how we're managing COVID in the community, it's really symptom management. It's in the less severe cases, it is more like a cold, sometimes a bad cold, sometimes, but it's only once kids get into the hospital and even the ICU where we really escalate up some of the more complicated medications.
Thank you for that. I think we just have, I'm sorry.
Can I add?
Yeah, please,
I think
Dr.
you should
Forbes.
also talk to your healthcare provider to find out if your child's high risk, were they to get COVID, because there are medications in the pipeline that may be available to prevent them from even being hospitalized. So talk to your healthcare provider about that.
Are you referring to the Merck?
I don't know who the manufacturer is.
No, okay.
Dr. Forbes, thanks for bringing that up. There is a monoclonal antibody, so kids that are infected with COVID-19 that are at high risk can get treated with a monoclonal antibody. And I guess that's fair. That would be a pre-admission treatment that could prevent hospitalization, but that's about it for otherwise.
And I would add to that, it's probably, especially for this audience who may have a lot of children in the 5 to 11-year-old category, the monoclonal antibody has FDA authorization, ages 12 and up, right? So it is not an option for our youngest children. It's 12 and up with underlying medical conditions.
Which is why you all are saying get them vaccinated.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. So, Monica, we just have a few minutes left now, and we're kind of wondering if everybody could kind of give us just a little final word on this, to wrap up, maybe a point that, in terms of our questions tonight, one you've gotten a lot in your own offices, in your own experience with patients and families.
Let's start with you, Dr.
Sure. I think this is the most exciting moment for me in the pandemic. And frankly, every month is a little more exciting because, as Dr. Bigham pointed out, we have followed the science.
We have learned what we've learned. We've taken care of our elders. We've taken care of our 12s and above. And now we can take care of our 5 to 11. And so the bubble of protection is expanding. And I just think this is a terrific time to move one step forward as a culture, as a community, in bringing this pandemic to an end. So I'm just thrilled.
Yeah, it's super exciting. As a pediatric infectious disease doctor, fewer patients, please. So get them vaccinated and keep them out of my clinic. As a mom, I'm super excited. You know, my 5-year-old is getting vaccinated here very soon, and we're thrilled. And the one thing I would emphasize is, as a doctor and as a mom, this vaccine is safe and it's effective. I took it myself and I'm giving it to my kids. I have no qualms about that.
And I will put an exclamation point on that comment. Yes, and I think for me that this is about trust. So much of this topic has been riddled with distrust and misinformation. I guess my parting comment would be, we don't have a relationship with everybody in your audience, but I'm hopeful that everybody in your audience has a relationship with a healthcare provider they trust. And I would encourage them to trust us, but if they're uncomfortable trusting our advice, to have a frank and honest conversation with their healthcare provider, because the evidence would say that almost all pediatricians are vaccinated, and they're not vaccinated because they're influenced by pharma or any other reason. They're vaccinated because they are critics of the science, they've studied the science, they believe in the science, and they've taken the vaccine themselves, and they believe in the vaccine and its ability to improve child health.
You know, one of the topics that we haven't touched on much tonight is some of the other effects that children have had related to the pandemic, right? It's the virtual schooling, it's sitting out of extracurricular activities, whether or not you're going to visit grandma and grandpa, if you're going to get on that plane trip for the holidays. And that's really taken a significant toll on our children. And so giving them the opportunity to get back to more of that semblance of normal and be able to do it with confidence, right? That we're comfortable as parents that our kids are going to be safe in those situations, and that the kids are feeling safe in those regards too. I think that is huge for their overall emotional development and their well-being. And I'll share, similar to Amy, I have 2 children in the 5 to 11-year-old category, so I cannot wait for their vaccine appointments that's coming up. They're equally as excited as I am too.
I can't thank each and every one of you enough for being part of this and this incredible informative hour. And I just want our audience to know, if you're watching live right now, this will be archived so you can share it. You can go to any of our digital platforms for WKYC and find it and share it. And we hope you do that. And more importantly, we hope you reach out to your pediatrician and have that conversation. Sarah, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you again to all of you for your time this evening, for working with us, and to all of you for joining us tonight and for sending us your questions. They're important, and we hope that we got them answered tonight. If we didn't, we have compiled a list of the most frequently asked questions and answers from our panel here, and you'll find that, as Monica said, on WKYC.com, archived along with this entire show if you want to go back and reference it. But we thank you so much for joining us tonight for this special edition of Front Row, and we will see you again tomorrow.